Welcome back to WCB Jazz Vinyl. So, Blue Note, who can't stop from staying in the news over the last couple of weeks, has another announcement, and that is the 2025 Blue Note Classic Vinyl Reissue Series calendar. And it includes a few surprises for sure. So before we dive into each of those 24 titles, hit like, hit subscribe, and you can follow me on Instagram at what_can_brown. So the Blue Note Classic Vinyl Reissue Series is not something new. In fact, it's been going on for several years. It's actually a continuation of the 80th anniversary series that launched some years ago. Each of these titles feature 180-gram vinyl reissues that are mastered by Kevin Gray from the original master tapes, and they are manufactured at Optimal. So a few key differences between this and the Tone Poet series, which I covered in a recent video. So first of all, the Tone Poet series is manufactured at RTI as opposed to Optimal. Joe Harley produces the Tone Poet series, whereas this one is actually curated, I believe, by Don Was, who's the president of Blue Note. Typically, Tone Poets focus only on Blue Note, but also have expanded to some other labels, whereas the Classic Vinyl series only includes Blue Note titles. And finally, typically Tone Poet has gatefold jackets, whereas Classic Vinyl Reissue Series does not. Of course, the other difference is that Tone Poets retail for $38.98, while Classic Vinyl Series retails for about $27.98. Kind of depends, it feels like. And actually, for these upcoming titles that are available for pre-order for January, they have been reduced to $19.58. I think as part of just a promotion that Blue Note is running right now across their entire website. So if you're interested, at least in these first two titles that are available for pre-order, maybe get that pre-order in sooner than later if you want to take advantage of that $19.58 price point. So now, what we're going to do is we're going to go across all 24 titles. I'm going to show them to you to the extent that I have them. I think I do have most of these. And yeah, I'm going to do a rundown, and at the very end I'm going to tell you which ones I think are the ones that I'm most excited about. So that's kind of the lay of the land. So let's just get going. All right, so as I go through these, keep in mind you can skip around with some of the chapter stops that are referenced in the description if you're looking for information on specific titles. But I'm going to go chronologically here. So the first one, actually the first two, are being put out on January 17th, and again are available for pre-order at this very moment. I don't think the others are just yet. So the first title is Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, Like Someone in Love. This is an interesting title because, well, it was recorded in 1960 and it was shelved, but it wasn't shelved and then reissued, say, in the 70s or 80s like so many of these others. It was actually shelved and released in 1967 in the Liberty Blue Note era. So this does feature an older Jazz Messengers lineup, which should probably excite many. It includes Lee Morgan, Wayne Shorter, Bobby Timmons, and Jimmy Merritt, in addition to Art Blakey. As far as the content here, it features a number of Wayne Shorter tunes, and I think one by Lee Morgan. This actually was recorded in the same session as A Night in Tunisia. So what it seems like is they recorded all of his content, maybe picked some of the standouts for A Night in Tunisia, and they ended up releasing the rest here. This title was previously tackled in the Music Matters 45 RPM series, but otherwise has been largely ignored by, say, the 75th anniversary series, 80th anniversary series, etc., up until now. So I think that this is going to be a exciting one for those of you who haven't heard it. This very much deserves to be its own album. It's not like it was really just the B-sides. It is good stuff. So the next one that's coming out on the very same day is a very interesting one. So this is Freddie Hubbard's Here to Stay. So this one was recorded in 1962, but shelved and released much later than Like Someone in Love. This was released in 1976, and it was actually part of a double LP set with some other content. So this is the album, though, in terms of it just being the Here to Stay album. So the interesting thing about this one is that it was included, I believe, on the inner sleeve for titles that were being put out in 1962. So it seemed very close to actually being released, but inevitably was held back and not released. So that's kind of interesting. As far as the lineup on here, we have Freddie Hubbard. He's also joined by Wayne Shorter, Cedar Walton, Reggie Workman, and Philly Joe Jones. So if you wanted this title otherwise, you would have had to pick it up in the Music Matters 45 RPM series as well. And I think probably, this is one of those titles probably that people really would have wanted in the Tone Poet series. But remember, what we know is that Joe Harley has indicated thus far, at least, that titles that he was a part of in the Music Matters series are not eligible for Tone Poet. So this would fall into that category, and I think it's great that that this is one of those titles that is now being put out in a, frankly, much less expensive version, because some of these Music Matters titles that were only available in Music Matters have gotten to be quite expensive. And this is not the only one, and I'll end up showing you a few others as this video gets going. So let's move on to February 21st, and the first title is Sonny Rollins's Volume 1. And you may actually be used to seeing this cover like this because it was actually reissued incorrectly with the wrong orientation. But probably this is how they're going to put it out in terms of the Classic Vinyl Reissue Series. So this was recorded in 1956 and released in 1957. The lineup includes Donald Byrd, Wynton Kelly, Gene Ramey, and Max Roach. I think that's it. Yep. This is mostly original compositions, including, I think, the standout Plain Jane, which I believe ended up making it as the sort of Blue Note issued single associated with this. This title has been available otherwise. It was included in the 75th anniversary series some years ago, but obviously not sourced from the original analog tapes. It was included in the Music Matters 33 RPM series, 45 RPM series, as well as, I think, an SRX. So this has been available, but again, not lately in terms of an all analog release. I think it was just a matter of time for them to put this out because it is indeed an excellent session. So the next one that is being put out is Dexter Gordon's Our Man in Paris. So again, on February 21st as well. So this was recorded and released in 1963, and this is an interesting title, I think, because it was not recorded at Rudy Van Gelder's studio, but instead at CBS Studios in Paris. Basically, the situation was that Dexter had moved to Copenhagen and recorded there with some other musicians that had actually relocated and were living in Copenhagen, including Bud Powell and Kenny Clark. And then it also features Pierre Michelot, I think is how you pronounce his last name. So this title sort of famously only consists of standards, and the rationale was that Bud Powell, who wasn't necessarily the most reliable, I suppose, musician at the time. He was going through a number of issues. Well, he wasn't really able or comfortable to learn new tunes, and so they had to choose sort of some of these standards that he was already familiar with in order to put together this session. If you wanted to get this otherwise, it was included in the 75th anniversary series. It was included in the Music Matters 33 RPM and 45 RPM series. But again, this is the first time in quite some time, I think, that we've had a all analog reissue. All right, so now we're on March 21st, and this is probably the first time where I'm kind of really noticing that the releases that are a part of each month, sometimes, not always, are related in some kind of way, whether the era, whether the musicians, the fact that they were shelved. And so I'm going to try to point that out, I suppose, as we continue going down this path. But anyway, the first title that I'm gonna mention here is the Horace Silver Quintet, and this is Serenade to a Soul Sister. So this was, this was recorded and released in 1968. Features Charles Tolliver, Stanley Turrentine, Bob Cranshaw, and Mickey Roker actually in the first few tracks, I think the first three. And then it's Benny Maupin, who subs for Turrentine, John Williams subs for Cranshaw, and Billy Cobham subs for Roker on the last three tracks. All of the material on here are compositions by Horace Silver. And this has not been reissued in any prior Blue Note reissue series of the last several decades. So not Music Matters and not 75th Anniversary Series. So it truly has been a while for this particular title, and it may indeed be new to some folks. I actually personally think it's somewhat underrated. I think people see this cover and perhaps the presence of Turrentine, or perhaps the fact that it's a later Horace Silver date, and they think that it's going to be overly sort of soul in a commercial way, and that's not at least entirely the case. So I do think that this one has some, certainly has some merit. It's a decent title. So I mentioned, that there's some commonality, right, between some of these. Well, this next one is also put out in 1968, and perhaps thematically has, some similarities anyway. So this is Lou Donaldson's Say It Loud. Incidentally, both of these are actually gatefold. I don't know if they're going to try to recreate that for the Blue Note Classic Vinyl Reissue Series. We'll see. So anyway, recorded in '68, released in '69. This is mostly covers, so covers of other tunes here, not originals. This has Lou Donaldson using the Veritone amplification system, which I'm not generally a fan of. I'm not a fan of it here either, but it's something that folks like Clark Terry and Sonny Stitt were messing around with around the same time. So this has not been reissued in any prior Blue Note reissue series of the last several decades either, so this may be new to some folks as well. The lineup includes Blue Mitchell, let's see, Charles Earland, Jimmy Ponder, and Leo Morris. So the sound here I would classify or describe as very smooth because of that Veritone amplification system. Know too that Lou Donaldson sings on the track Say It Loud with some of the backup musicians doing a kind of call and response. It just comes across as a very commercial effort overall, but it does have a few moments that are enjoyable. I think they do a rendition of Caravan, and I'm trying to think what else, but there are some moments, but this is not really one of the standout albums in the Blue Note series. It's certainly not a standout in Lou Donaldson's catalog, and in fact, it may be one of his lesser efforts. So April is the month of 80s reissues. So this is April 18th, and the first one is Tony Williams's Civilization. So this was recorded in 1986. I actually don't own a copy of this. And as I've mentioned in some of my prior videos, I've sort of unfairly ignored some of the reissues of the 80s, and these two actually for April I would include in that kind of statement. So this one features Sharnette Moffett on bass, Mulgrew Miller on piano, Wallace Roney on trumpet, Billy Pierce on soprano as well as tenor, and obviously Tony Williams on drums as well as drum machine. It's a great lineup. And this one is I think this one's going to sound great and probably surprise a lot of people who otherwise don't listen to music from this era, or at least it surprised me when I listened to it. It was just really well recorded. You can hear it in, even if you just stream it, you can tell that it was recorded a little bit in a more modern era, and it just sounds really excellent. This is one that I would say I hope they give a new cover, just because I don't think the 1980s in general were known for having great album covers, at least not for jazz. So the next one is Don Pullen's New Beginnings. So this was released by Blue Note in 1989. It is a trio format with Gary Peacock on bass and Tony Williams on drums. So that's a fantastic trio. And I think actually this is great stuff as well. I do think that it highlights Don Pullen's style very well as well, without being, say, overly avant-garde. So this is not as out there structurally, but certainly Pullen's style of sort of playing up and down the keys and these sort of cascading statements is definitely leveraged here. This is another one, by the way, that I hope they give a new cover. And I can't necessarily say they should, because they're trying to honor the original stuff. It's just that, I don't know, sometimes you want to have a pretty cover, like so many of these early Reed Miles or Reed Miles inspired covers, and I just don't think we got a lot of that in the 80s. All right, May has some exciting titles, both put out in 1960. So the first one is Roll Call by Hank Mobley. So this one features Freddie, Hubbard, Wynton Kelly, Paul Chambers, Art Blakey, obviously Hank Mobley. So this is a classic album. This is a highlight, I think, in Hank Mobley's entire catalog. So fantastic choice, I think, to be included. This was last released in the Music Matters 45 RPM series, but not otherwise since the Classic Records release, which is different than the Classic Vinyl series, as well as the Disc Union or DBLP series. So, again, a classic. I've highlighted this in prior videos because I was able to get this. Let's see, this was one that I think was categorized under the Classic Records reissue, but it ended up being, and it was a fair price, but when I got it, it ended up being an original. So I paid like $50 for it and was super excited when that came in. Probably going to hold on to my copy, but for those of you who don't have a copy, I think this is going to be a great way to hear it. The next one is Stanley Turrentine's Look Out. Lately, there's been a lot of shade on the internet thrown at Stanley Turrentine. This is a phenomenal, phenomenal session. I think it's one of the best in his catalog. So again, released in 1960, the lineup includes Horace Pullen, George Tucker, and Al Harewood. So it is that kind of single horn format with rhythm section. And otherwise, this has been a relatively difficult one to get. An original copy like this tends to be quite expensive, and otherwise it's only been available in the Music Matters 45 RPM series. All right, so June 20th, the unifying theme is that these were both put out in 1962. So this is Babyface Willette's Stop and Listen. So this one has Grant Green, Ben Dixon, and just Babyface Willette. So it's actually a trio with drums, guitar, and organ. This album is super moody and fun. I really love this session, despite the fact that it's an organ-led album. I actually think Babyface Willette's albums are some of the best organ-led albums. Although obviously we're about to talk about another one, which is another unifying theme for June. So otherwise, if you wanted to get a copy of this, it was put out in the Classic Record Series, but actually that's it. So it wasn't previously tackled by Music Matters, which I think is perhaps somewhat surprising because they had many opportunities to do so and they just didn't. So this next one, again, 1962, and organ-led, this is Freddie Roach's Down to Earth. So the lineup here includes Percy France, Kenny Burrell, Freddie Roach, and Clarence Johnson. So this album, I would say, is underrated in my opinion. It's also borderline impossible to find a clean original copy of this. If you're gonna, I think it's possible that folks are not as familiar with this because it just hasn't had as many reissues. Check out the opening track, Duh Bug, just because I think you'll love it. And so to the point that this hasn't otherwise really been available, and by the way, when I say available and I say, oh, it hasn't been reissued, what I'm referring to is like a recent all analog edition of it, right? You can get reissues of this stuff, I think for the most part from the 60s and 70s, and certainly Japanese releases and things like that. But what I'm talking about is kind of more in sort of a recent memory over the last few decades. So this is the first time that it's been released in any of the sort of quality all analog series, right? So this hasn't been featured in, any of the recent Blue Note, whether Music Masters or hasn't been, Classic Records, etc. So anyway, it is an interesting one. I mentioned it's hard to find clean. My copy is not very clean, and so it's very possible that this is going to be one of the ones that I'm going to pick up. All right, next up, July 18th. The first is Donald Byrd's Steppin' Into Tomorrow. So this is what it looks like. This is one of those Donald Byrd albums that features the Mizell brothers. So know that in terms of their involvement with producing, and there's background vocals, and it's really doing that kind of thing. This was actually one of my entry points, though, to Blue Note, so I do have a soft spot for this record. So the other musicians that are on this, there's a number of them, and so actually, let me see if I can even paraphrase, because there's a number of musicians who actually I'm not as familiar with. But Harvey Mason, Chuck Rainey is on it, David T. Walker, John Rowan, Roger Saint, James Carter, I think, but he only whistles. Like, it's an interesting lineup. It feels like it was probably curated by the Mizell brothers for the sound that they were trying to achieve. So it's a little bit different than other Blue Note sessions. In this, remember, this was put out in the BNLA sort of era, which is like mid 70s, like 74, 75, something like that. So this is super funky. It is heavily produced, kind of has that like synth chord backing with like super smooth Byrd, Donald Byrd's like tone over it. And I know the style isn't for everybody, but again, I do have a soft spot for this later period Donald Byrd, and I do really like it, which is why I have a copy. So the next one is also from the same era. So again, unifying theme here. This is Eddie Henderson's Heritage. This is different but similar in terms of its style. It does have synthesizer. It is, it is funky, but it is not as smooth, I would say. I would say it's grittier than that Donald Byrd sort of heavily produced album. Let's see what to say about this. I mean, Henderson does leverage the Harmon mute, and so in some ways sounds like Miles Davis. In fact, I think his style here is leaning into what Miles Davis was doing at the time, and may even forecast some of the style that Miles Davis would actually play later in the 80s, which is kind of interesting. I would say check out the track Inside You, which is the opener. It's fantastic and super funky, and I think it sort of helps set the vibe for what this album is. As far as the lineup, you've got Paul Jackson, Hadley Kaliman, M. Tume, Billy Hart, Mike Clark, Patrice Rushen, Julian Priester, and Woody Theus. Theus? I think that's right. I think that I'll say more about this probably at the end in terms of what I think are sort of the standouts or the surprises. This may be the biggest pleasant surprise of the bunch if you're not familiar with Eddie Henderson. All right, so perhaps one of the strongest months of the entire calendar is August. So this is August 15th, and both of these were shelved sessions. So not released at the time, but released much later. The first one that I'm going to talk about is Wayne Shorter's The Soothsayer. So here is a Music Matters edition, just for kind of reference. My guess is that they're probably going to replicate this cover art that they put out. So this was recorded in 1965. It was shelved until 1979 with the kind of atrocious covers that are common in from the LT series. And I've owned a copy of that, but ended up upgrading to this Music Matters at some point. So this album includes James Spaulding, Ron Carter, Tony Williams, and McCoy Tyner, as well as Freddie Hubbard. So I mentioned Music Matters. This was otherwise only available in the Music Matters 45 RPM series as far as a recent release, and this is one of the most expensive titles to get in that Music Matters series today. So, jokes on all the people who spent the money on this, right? Because now you're going to be able to get an all analog version for $27-28, right, as part of the classic series. So maybe it'll be interesting to A/B those, although probably not needed. I mean, both mastered by Kevin Gray, right? So I'm sure that it's going to be a great addition to get, just perhaps not gatefold and not 45 RPM. So the second one. This is an interesting inclusion, and I think it was forecasted in the Blue Note Review Volume 3 box set that focused on Lee Morgan, because we had so much content that was modern musicians covering tunes from this album, which is Lee Morgan's The Procrastinator. So this is also a Music Matters edition. So the content was recorded in 1967, but shelved until 1978. And it really wasn't available, I would say, in a standalone format in the US for a little bit. It was kind of put out in this like double LP version with some other content from 1969, actually, was grouped with this with the session from 67. So, as I mentioned, Music Matters put this out, but that's really the only other edition that we've had in an all-analog sort of quality format lately. All the tunes here are Lee Morgan and Wayne Shorter originals, and I think that that's something that's fun. And as far as the lineup, you got Billy Higgins, Ron Carter, Herbie Hancock, obviously Lee Morgan and Wayne Shorter, as well as Bobby Hutcherson. So this is a very exciting one. This is also one of those that kind of got a little bit more expensive, and so again, I think it's great that that so many folks are going to be able to get a really nice quality sort of modern repressing of this. All right, next up, these are some heavy titles for September. This is September 19th, and the first one is Sonny Clark's Sonny's Crib. So this includes Paul Chambers, Art Taylor, John Coltrane, Curtis Fuller, and Donald Byrd on this record. Really fantastic hard bop, fiery playing, a lot of great solos, especially because you have those three horns. This was previously included in the Music Matters 45 RPM series as well as the Classic Records series, but otherwise, if you're going to get an original, they're quite expensive. This is a very sought after album, and so I think it's great that people are going to be able to check this out. So the next one is one, so for the most part, as I've been walking through these, I'm showing you either my original copies or I'm showing you Music Matters, if that's kind of how it was sort of put out in a quality form. And this next one, it was originally released at its sort of time in 1961, but I've never been able to own an original copy because they're just so hard to get. So this is a Music Matters copy, obviously easy to settle for one of these. So again, released in 1961, and the lineup includes Jackie McLean, Paul Chambers, Lewis Hayes, and Tina Brooks. So again, previously released in this Music Matters 45 RPM series, as well as the Classic Records series. As far as the music goes, I mean, it's phenomenal. I would say it kind of has a cinematic nature to some of this, and kind of maybe a surprising sound, I'd say, for this era, because you expect it to all be hard bop, and it's just not necessarily. All right, so October 17th, and this next one I think is going to please a lot of people. So this is Grant Green's Solid. So this is the Music Matters edition. Have every indication that this is probably the cover that they're going to go for this classic series release as well. So this title, I think, is going to be in high demand because it was recorded in 1964, but actually shelved until 1979. It was put out in that LT series, and it's a phenomenal record. And really, all of these Grant Green sessions that were shelved and have been put out lately in the Tone Poet series, right, and now in the Classic Vinyl Reissue series, they've just all been phenomenal. I'm thinking Nigeria, but really all of them. So this album includes in the lineup James Spaulding, Bob Cranshaw, Elvin Jones, McCoy Tyner, and excitingly Joe Henderson. And he adds a really nice element here. I would characterize this album not being as sort of overwhelmingly Grant Green, because you do have Joe Henderson's horn, and he definitely gets some great solo time on this record. So this previously had both this 45 RPM release. There's also 33 RPM and I think an SRX edition. So it was visited repeatedly by the Music Matters team. But these days, because it hasn't really been released otherwise in a quality edition, those Music Matters titles have gotten pretty expensive. And so I think it's fantastic for everyone to not have to spend the money that it cost me for this, but to be able to get it in this Classic Vinyl Reissue series. Just more evidence that, if you're willing to wait, then good things come, right? So the second title that's being put out also has Elvin Jones in it, actually. So this is Elvin Jones's Putting It Together. So what I'm holding is actually the Liberty release. This was originally put out in 1968 and I think released in 1968. And it's got kind of a Coltrane-esque lineup. Not only do you have Elvin Jones, you also have Jimmy Garrison, who at one point played with Coltrane, and then you have Joe Farrell providing that the sax. So again, kind of Coltrane-esque, if you will. No piano though on this, so kind of starker anyway, but an amazing recording. This was previously put out in the Music Matters 45 RPM series, but otherwise has not had a quality all analog release. All right, November is another stellar month. So November 21st is the release date, and the first title is Judgment by Andrew Hill. A lot of people have been waiting for this one. They expected it, I think, to be part of the Tone Poet series, but here it is, part of the Classic Vinyl Reissue series. So this was recorded in 1963 and I think put out in 1964. The lineup here, well, we have Richard Davis, we have Elvin Jones, and Bobby Hutcherson joining Andrew Hill. Only other way to get an all-analog reissue lately has been the Music Matters 45 edition, 45 RPM edition, which is why it's not a candidate for Tone Poet. But like I said, I think this is going to please a lot of people. This is one of the more sort of challenging listens, I suppose. Sort of less structure, right? Because Andrew Hill was doing so much experimentation with music and really advancing the jazz medium as a whole. So definitely some of the most challenging music, I would say, in the 2025 sort of calendar lineup. And that is actually some of the connective tissue between the other release, the other connective tissue being that it was also put out in 1964, and that is Jackie McLean's One Step Beyond. So this is a fantastic album as well. This includes Eddie Kahn, Tony Williams, Gretchen Monker, and Bobby Hutcherson joining Jackie McLean. And like I said, this is getting to be a little bit more free, similar to Judgment, but in a different way. Jackie McLean, I think, with a number of these albums in the mid 60s, he was getting progressively sort of more experimental, I think, with his music, and and in this case, doing some things without a piano, right? Having that vibraphone voice provided by Bobby Hutcherson instead of a piano. So similar as well to Judgment, the only other way to get an all analog recent reissue of this is the Music Matters 45 RPM, which again, some of these are getting to be quite expensive. So I think what it feels like to me is Blue Note is doing a decent job at bringing forward some of these sessions that are in such demand, and giving them sort of a fresh release so that more people can hear them. All right, and the last two for 2025. So this is December 12th, and the first title is Jimmy Smith's House Party. So this is kind of an interesting one in that there's a variety of folks across multiple lineups on this that perform. This is actually the first time that this has been reissued in an all analog format. So I think so sort of a gap, right, in the catalog in terms of Music Matters and all of these other different treatments, but we're finally getting it in December. So this is recorded in 1957 and put out in 1958. Like I said, it does include a couple of lineups, but overall, the musicians that are on here, it's quite impressive. So there's George Coleman, Lou Donaldson, Art Blakey, Donald Bailey, Eddie McFadden, Kenny Burrell, Tina Brooks, Curtis Fuller, and Lee Morgan. So pretty exciting. And because there's so many horns in this is not as sort of densely Jimmy Smith in terms of like him doing these extended solos that have a tendency to at least bore me. The other thing to note, actually, is that this was not, even though it was recorded by Rudy Van Gelder, I'm almost positive it wasn't recorded at Rudy Van Gelder's studio. It was recorded at Manhattan Towers. And so, yeah, it does say recording by Rudy Van Gelder on this. So they used a different studio, I think, because of some of the larger format. And remember, this was at a time, I believe, let me think about this, believe this is still... No, this wouldn't have been actually when he was at the Hackensack, the Hackensack studio, right? So anyway, I don't know, but they decided to go for a larger studio in any event for this recording. So the final one that's coming out, I think, is pretty exciting. So this is Johnny Griffin's A Blowing Session. And my copy is a little bit worse for wear, which is one of the reasons why I also have a Music Matters edition of this, but this is my original. So this is recorded in 1957, includes Paul Chambers, Art Blakey, Wynton Kelly, Hank Mobley, John Coltrane, and Lee Morgan in this lineup. So that is why it's called A Blowing Session. I think there's only 4 tracks on this because they are extended in order to accommodate all of these horns playing solos. So again, longer format tracks. This has had a number of additions over time, including the Music Matters 33 RPM, Music Matters 45 RPM, the SRX edition, as well as classic records. So there have been no shortage of ways to hear this, but guess what? This is the first time you're going to be able to hear it for about that $28 price point. So I think this is going to get a lot of energy from a lot of people. So, final thoughts. What am I most excited about? What do I think is noteworthy about this list? So, first of all, I think the overall highlights, as far as what stood out to me, have to be, well, maybe a few things. So, firstly, that solid. So, Grant Green's solid, Wayne Shorter's The Soothsayer, Freddie Hubbard's Here to Stay, and Lee Morgan's The Procrastinator. Those were all titles that we knew were not going to be included in the Tone Poet series because they had been tackled by Music Matters. And otherwise, those editions, those Music Matters editions, were getting just so expensive. So I think it's something to celebrate that they're actually being put out in the Classic Vinyl Reissue Series, making them affordable for everybody who wants to hear the music. And remember, we still have Kevin Gray doing the mastering, right? So otherwise, if I'm going to say some highlights, I think, let's see, Andrew Hill's Judgment is a big one. Sonny Clark's Sonny's Crib, Johnny Griffin's A Blowing Session, which I just concluded on, Hank Mobley's Roll Call, and then Freddie Red's Shades of Red. So each of those are, very sought after by appreciators and collectors, and I just think really great inclusions because of the stellar music on each of them. Then if I'm going to say like what's kind of like the biggest sleeper maybe that you weren't aware of that, maybe, I don't know, but that's worth your time and worth your exploration, Eddie Henderson's Heritage. So, Eddie Henderson doesn't necessarily have the same name that some of these others, sort of strength of name as some of these other leaders, but that's a really good session and kind of a curious inclusion, but very good music. And maybe maybe a little bit of the disappointing side, like might there have been something else that they could have slotted in? I would say Lou Donaldson's Say It Loud. It's not a terrible album. I mean, I know that there's some people that trash it. It's not terrible. It's just that the baritone, his singing, it's definitely a little bit more commercial. And don't get me wrong, I like sort of happy, feel-good music, and I really love Lou Donaldson. I just think that it's just not necessarily sort of the strongest pick. But here's the thing: in any of these calendars, you can't please everybody with every release. It's impossible. And there's probably going to be plenty of people out there who actually do appreciate this one, just maybe not for me. So obviously the challenge for me here is that listen, I have every one of these releases in one form or another, except for those two sessions from the 80s. So, to the extent that I'm going to be, changing out copies that I already have, probably not. I probably am going to stick with the Music Matters versus getting the Classic Vinyl Reissue Series, even though it offers that 33 RPM format, which is obviously easier because you're not flipping the discs over. I also think that probably now is going to be a good time for people to actually pick up these 45 RPM editions as the prices go down, because people ditch them with the hope of sort of maximizing the money they can get out of it, so that they then can get the sort of quality Classic Vinyl series when it comes out. So there could be an opportunity there for people who want to pick up the Music Matters. But arguably, maybe your better bet is just waiting for that Classic Vinyl Reissue Series and grabbing a copy, because I think lately Blue Note has demonstrated that they are indeed quality releases. So, I don't know what I'm going to pick up at this point, because I think I have decent copies of most of these, and obviously some I had to get the Music Matters because I couldn't get an original. My copy of Johnny Griffin's A Blowing Session is not in great shape, but that's why I got the Music Matters. So, I don't know. I would say generally I'm not really the target audience for the Classic Vinyl Reissue Series, because I do tend to collect originals. Even though I understand that doesn't make sense probably if your primary focus is the music, like why spend more money on these originals? But that's just the game that I'm in, right? So, I'm still excited. I'm still excited the music's coming out. I'm excited for everybody who wants to hear the music. And it's possible that, as these get released, maybe I'll have an inclination to pick one up and do some type of sonic comparison, or I don't know, maybe I'll go and see if any of mine are in lesser shape and I want to have a clean, sort of great sounding copy. Well, then I'll know to just go for that Classic Vinyl Reissue. So yeah, that's it for me. Be curious what others think. If there was any titles that they really wished were going to be included, now that we sort of know the entire gamut of Blue Note's releases for 2025, or if you have any other sort of feedback or comments on the titles that they decided to include. So leave those comments in the comments section, and I guess that's it for me. So thanks everyone for sticking with me, and I'll see you next time.